and then move on to more discussion with you all. We're really interested in more of a conversation about how we understand these applications and how we're thinking about applying and interpreting them on campus and in you. We begin with the fact that across the world right now, across the US, universities and colleges are grappling with the calls to diversify but also decolonize their curricula. This charge poses a number of academic and logistical challenges, but also intellectual opportunities to enhance scholarly rigor, cross-cultural communication, racial literacy, and critical thinking. So we had a conversation last spring with many colleagues. So this conversation is already happening on campus, and we know it's happening across units, across disciplines, and we're trying to cohere the conversation, bring people into a collective campus-wide debate and discussion on this issue. So we also just wanted to say that universities, land-grant universities, Ivy League universities, community colleges, the whole diversity of higher education institutions are thinking about this, and students and faculty are demanding that universities think through the decolonization of academia and the curriculum. This is unfolding in conferences. This is happening in England, in South Africa, in Mexico, also in India. And so these are just a few kind of online, posters and book covers and journal covers about the intellectual and the academic and the logistical and the political call and responses to this challenge. This book in particular, we'll be talking about a little bit moving forward. So this is unfolding in various disciplines. And what would this look like? And so I have a few initial ideas, and I'd love to get everyone's feedback on this. First, it would include incorporating more colonial history and geography, actually research, history, discussion of the mechanisms and impacts of colonialism, from genocidal displacement of indigenous peoples to transcontinental enslavement and slave-based economies, just more data, more qualitative and quantitative research on the actual work of colonialism and the impact of it. Second, it would entail more research, teaching, and dialogue perhaps on the multiple moments and methods of resistance, anti-colonial rebellion, escapes, abolition, revolution, emancipation, independence from colonialism and enslavement, and the transcontinental alliances and solidarity in these struggles. So it's not just a story of domination, but a story of resistance the whole way. Thirdly, however, we would need more research, teaching, and dialogue on the ways colonialist modes of domination and subjugation persist through racialized and gendered exploitation, and the nuances really of what we're calling, what I have come to call coloniality. So how the mindset of colonialism persists long after independence has been declared and emancipation has been won. So the nuances of Eurocentric modernity and the micro and macro aggressions and hegemonies that are within the syllabus and reproduced in the syllabus across disciplines. So, well-meaning individuals and innocuous institutions are actually the mechanisms by which white supremacy and other colonialist mindsets reproduce themselves. Fourthly, I think that is, drawing upon the wealth of academic literature from post-colonial and decolonial scholars and theorists across the Americas. And in Americas, colonialism unfolded in certain ways, which is different, of course, than how colonialism unfolded in Africa and in Asia. So having students understand the divergent experiences of colonialism and coloniality and resistances thereof. And I would say this is going to be political. This is going to be a very provocative direction for a university to move in. But the argument, I think, by our colleagues as we think through this is that it's actually it's a more rigorous way of approaching general education and what it means to be educated. So I'm thinking about, we could frame it as a meta-analysis of the epistemology of canon making. So we include whatever we include in our syllabi, and then we make room, either course by course or discipline or unit by unit, on the process by which canon making happens. So that students at both the undergrad level and the graduate doctoral level are thinking through the power dynamics of making a canon, even as they're also memorizing and learning from the specific, assigned text that they have. And finally, I'm just thinking through what I have come to call, it's not exactly the right term, and people have been using a lot of different ways to think through this, but the pre-colonial canons. So it's not as if post-colonial or decolonial scholarship is just starting with the 21st century and diversifying, who the scholars are, but what would it look like to have a deeper research, teaching, and dialogue on the canons that preceded colonialism. How would we make room in general education on the diversity of great classical intellectual traditions, from the Mayan Popol Vuh, Islamic sciences, Confucian ethics, to the Bhagavad Gita, and understand that these are not traditions, static traditions. These are living legacies of ancient, lines of knowledge that are very diverse, obviously, in and of themselves. What would it mean to have students become educated, globally minded students? Wouldn't they need to at least be introduced to that diverse canons beyond just Enlightenment European canons? So I think I'll just go through that. This is a lot of things are happening on campus. The Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center and the History Department at SIS is a great forum for maybe these ongoing conversations. There's a lot happening with the Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies Collaborative, Ethnographies of Empire Research Cluster at SIS. So maybe a takeaway from this morning could be a convergence of all of the initiatives that are happening across campus, and think through what would a mega or a larger initiative look like across campus. And then I'll just say, Mal and I were talking about, there's an idea of decolonizing as a metaphor, and the risk of just having it be a kind of a catch-all, diversity, diversify your canon. Decolonizing is very profound, and Indigenous scholars are saying you've got to talk about land tenure, you've got to talk about reparations, real material decolonization, not just diversifying, the authors on your syllabus. AU was just gifted airily a huge piece of land, so we have a wealth of assets at AU. What would it look like to think through decolonizing both intellectually, our curriculum, and our general education and our core canon, as well as materially, the logistics of our university, and think through justice on that level. So thank you.
Oh, this is my slide, but you can
Oh, yes.
No, it's fine. You can. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Wednesday morning before classes start. Really appreciate it. I want to start definitely by thanking my colleague Garrett Graddy-Lovelace for gathering us together, and she's been a real force and a voice on this campus for pushing for decolonial approaches, and thanks to her, which will come together again today. So thank you, Garrett. So my name is Malini Ranganathan, and I am assistant professor at SIS, where I work broadly on urban environmental justice, particularly on challenges related to water and property, and the kinds of ways that these intersect with social, economic, and cultural difference. I have ongoing projects in both urban India and Washington, D.C. I'm just going to start by talking about how I center this analytic of decolonization in my own work and teaching, and then point to a few broad ways that we as a community can start thinking about decolonizing. And then I also want to talk about this engagement on social media, on Twitter, where I have been active, and I find some really interesting conversations going on there, so I'll quickly flag that towards the end. So as I mentioned, I bring the analytic of decolonizing, and I'll think what I specifically mean by that in a second, to my teaching, even on the environment, right? And so I teach classes on environment, sustainability, and global health. And for those who might not be aware, the environment can be quite a narrowly taught field in the American academy. It can be taught in very racially exclusionary ways, as just the scientific and policy study of conserving wilderness and biodiversity, reducing pollution, or improving the efficiency of technology. But I specifically teach against this narrow understanding of the environment, insisting that the challenges faced by and demands voiced by low-income communities of color around healthy food, for instance, mining on native reservations, toxic dumping, water cutoffs, as we've seen in Detroit, for instance, recently, childhood asthma, etc. All these properly be thought of as environmental. And here I'm just really standing on the shoulder of giants, especially EJ activists who have long insisted that we adopt a broader and much more intersectional and racially just and inclusive conceptualization of the environment. Surprisingly, these calls, while they're coming to the fore in the academy, they haven't actually taken root universally. So as late as June 2018, so just a few months ago, I was invited to speak at the University of California, Davis, at their environmental policy department, where there's been a very glaring omission of environmental justice. And I learned that one of the reasons why I was invited to speak on that campus was that students have been up in arms, that the department does not have one faculty of color, and has not offered one EJ course or any socially relevant course as far as the environment goes. And they called for, in their own way, a decolonizing of the environmental policy department at this large research land grant university in California. It's quite a prominent university. So this is just to give you a sense of how these calls for decolonizing have kind of traveled across the academy and filtered down into different types of departments and different types of disciplines. So now coming to, okay, what does exactly this mean? What does it mean to me? And I want to really flag here that there's a pluralistic understanding of decolonizing, and in some ways contentious as well, right? As Garrett said, this is provocative. So I'm going to start by saying what it doesn't mean to me. And here, my dear colleague Betsy Cohn is here, and we had this conversation actually in April, where she suggested that that this is actually an open question, whether in fact I should have just a hardline view on this. But what decolonizing does not mean to me is exactly what Garrett said. It's not simply the superficial tinkering of your syllabus where you add one or two people of color scholars or one or two scholars with global south sounding names on your syllabus in the hopes that somehow now you have a more diverse decolonial syllabus, right? This is kind of a dangerous cooptation and a kind of simplification, watering down of the term. The problem with this kind of tinkering is that you do not question the very foundations of what counts as knowledge. You leave unquestioned the epistemological basis of your discipline or field or your chosen topic of instruction. So it doesn't mean this kind of superficial tinkering. It does not mean to me, secondly, just talking about colonialism and how it was bad in a very empiricist way and leaving it at that, right? Or talking about histories of slavery and just kind of leaving it at that, right? I don't think that's enough. I worry sometimes that for our students, right, suddenly everything becomes reducible to kind of a past history without recognizing how these reproduce in the present. And so like Garrett, I've started thinking about the purchase of the term coloniality, right, and how that continues to manifest in contemporary relations, both in material ways as well as discursive and knowledge-based ways. So then this brings me to what decolonizing does represent to me. Rather than just tinkering with your syllabus in terms of making it more diverse, right? It means really looking at the structure of your syllabus and asking yourself, are you using the space of your course to trouble taken for granted assumptions about what counts as knowledge? Does your syllabus question the canon itself, right? So in my case, since I teach on environment and health, it means questioning things like terms like population, and really questioning what that actually means. And its kind of roots within very, very exclusionary projects. It means questioning things like tropical medicine, right? The colonial roots of health, as well as how that continues to play out today in racialized tropes. And so here in this epistemological questioning, I'm reminded of the critical race theorist Charles W. Mills's work on epistemologies of white ignorance. Mills says, quote, "White ignorance is a particular pattern of global cognitive dysfunctions, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made." Right? So white ignorance kind of manifests in this unwillingness to really question the foundations of knowledge. And for me, I think one of the key aspects of decolonizing is disrupting this. This brings me back to the fact that within the environment, for instance, the field, people often ask me, well, why do you teach topics of race in the environment? What does that have to do with race? And I find this kind of sanctioned white ignorance that I'm talking about a very key example of it. The second thing that decolonizing means to me is, as I mentioned, recognizing the coloniality of the present, right? So recognizing how relations of modernity, relations to do with domination, as well as resistance, retool themselves and look today in the present. And so this is not just the study of the legacies of the imperial period on the contemporary period, but rather what do new forms of extraction, epistemic violence, and the maintenance of racial, caste, ethnic, and religious other hierarchies look like in the present? So I'll end by, if you can move forward. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't. So this is a conversation going on Twitter, right? Which I think is really interesting and goes to show, as Garrett was saying, that this is a phenomenon that is taking root, around the world. So here is a student, a Black British student, Nayla, who says, "I find it very odd that we aren't taught any Black British history in schools. No Mary Segal, no Bristol bus boycotts, no Olive Morris, no Brixton riots, no Stephen Lawrence. It continues to narrate that racism doesn't happen here and that we never had a civil rights movement, right? This is, again, an example of white ignorance. And this is what it looks like in Britain. It looks different than what it looks like in the United States, but it is equally poignant and is part of a general decolonizing, like Rhodes Must Fall sort of move within the British universities. So this got quite a few retweets and likes within the academic field. This counts a lot. 14,000 might not be as much in other fields, but certainly for an academic. And then I tweeted this last semester towards the end of it, and I got a few retweets and likes, where I was thinking about how does one teach theory, right? And when I look at social theory syllabi, I always see kind of the same usual suspects like Marx, Weber, other major white male theorists. And then kind of tucked in at the very end are a few postcolonial, anti-racist theorists. And I went, as a kind of thought experiment, what would it mean to switch the ordering of that? And I got some interesting comments. I got some pushback saying, well, how does one do that? How does one, what would it actually look like? Are we doing our students justice if we actually don't start by the canon, because that's what they're going to be tested on, right? And so I'm just curious, right? So I said I want to teach a class called Social Theory for Emancipation, where we would read Ambedkar, Fanon, James, C.L.R. James, Cesar, Spivak, Mohanty, Hall, Mignolo, Robinson, Baldwin, Winter, and then read canonical social theory instead of the other way around. And my follow-on was that the reason for doing this would demonstrate the poverty of canonical theory. Mm-hmm. So I'll just end it there and leave that as a kind of provocative.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for inviting me. It was very interesting when Garrett wrote to me and said, do you want to participate? Because I had been one of you in the spring in one of the roundtables, and I think I was questioning too many things because I was coming from another angle, and I was just one of those days that you feel like talking, and actually that happens to me often. And I was just like, well, what about this? What about that? And then Garrett said, okay, then come and just talk about it. And now I say, well, here I am. So I'm talking from a different angle, that's for sure. And I'm just going to explain a little bit what I do, how I approach that very controversial, I would say, issue of decoloniality and the canon, what is the canon and what is not the canon. And I will bring probably a different element here, which will be the use of the language, in which language you teach, and whether there are languages that are more colonial than others. And that's for sure that, you sometimes think you are teaching a language that is a language of resistance, and that depends where you are. The language of resistance is not the same language if you are here and if you are in Latin America, if you are, somewhere else. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm just giving you like the highlights now. Who owns this? I mean, there is something that Aníbal Quijano from Peru, who's also somebody you mentioned in the spring, who's talked about coloniality, and actually he owns this concept of coloniality. Coloniality, according to him, is completely linked to asymmetrical power and asymmetry of power. So within the disciplines at the university, there is that asymmetrical power, not only of disciplines, of the schools as well. Sometimes you teach at the school, at the department, where what you do is almost goes without being seen, and other schools have more like visibility because they own something that is kind of more, powerful for sure. So that's a little bit what I wanted to say, and I'm going to talk and explain this, taking some examples. So first of all, I would like to say that when I started, I'm a bit more senior than you, and I did my PhD in the 90s, early 90s, and when I did my PhD, I didn't realize that I was talking about something that, kind of simultaneously, but I wasn't too much aware of it. I did my PhD in Britain, and that was the very beginning of the postcolonial kind of theories, and we were talking about that, but not at a great extent. But I had gone to Peru thinking that I was going to work on, my field was literature, Peruvian literature. And I did my PhD, as I said, at the University of Liverpool. There was one of those area studies departments along with in Cambridge and Southampton that in the 60s had had this kind of multi-interdisciplinary approach to Latin America. It was like the Latin American Studies Institute. So I thought I was being like doing something very interesting. And actually, when I went to Peru, that was in the late 80s, I realized that what I wanted to do was something very different, because I found what it meant to be in the periphery versus the center. And that was the concept that we used in the 90s, periphery and the center. So I worked on the periphery of literature, looking into the impact of social change on the production of literature from different locals. So from people who came from migrant experience from rural areas, from women who were, starting publishing and having a more powerful voice. And that's, I don't have the time now to go into that, because it's also like the crisis of the Peruvian state kind of brought about that kind of opening. So those people who would have been very marginalized kind of found ways to be publishing in mainstream publishing houses in Peru, which didn't mean too much to, in other places like in Europe or in the States, but those publishing houses were mainstream there. So those people kind of traveled from the margins where they came from. They were the children of migrants and so on. They kind of had, literary activity at university, and they managed to publish mainstream, but that mainstream was not mainstream anywhere else. So that's how I see it, So for us, those people who published there were marginalized. To them, they were at the center because they had traveled to the center. So then my second book, I moved to Mexico. I lived in Mexico. I don't want to talk about myself too much, but I lived for 15 years in Latin America, and that really kind of shaped my way of thinking, probably. But I originally come from Barcelona, which is another complicated place to come from, because we have all these issues between, being Catalan or being Spanish. So, probably my Catalan kind of being was also traveling with me when I went to Latin America. And the same thing happened when I went to Mexico, because I was working on the border from the Mexican perspective. And, in Tijuana, somebody that for us here in the States is seen as, a very kind of marginal writer or poet. That was mainstream in Tijuana. So again, the same thing, and that has repeated itself. So all my research has been done in this way without even me realizing why I was doing it this way. My project now is more like intended to be this way, because I learned that there was something, there was theory behind this, and it's actually how representations of indigeneity in Latin America can colonize or decolonize through cinema. So I'm working on films from the 20s, 1920s, 30s, how, for instance, Mexican films after the revolution, how they colonize or recolonize the indigenous imaginary by converting those indigenous people into peasants. They are not indigenous anymore, they are men, they are peasants. The revolution did bring them to that kind of, new category. So I'm working on Paraguay and Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia. Some of the countries have been in my research for a long time. Some of them are really new to me. So, but what I do when I take these experiences, which is my own research, to the classroom, because I have the privilege to be teaching area studies courses and in Spanish, and we can choose very much what we do. So sometimes I teach on indigeneity. This is a course that's called Indigenous Peoples of Latin America. Or there is another one that is diasporas and cultures in Latin America. What happens there? Well, there, for instance, and that's what worries me a lot. And I have concerns, and I don't have the answers to this. So, for instance, the indigenous peoples of Latin America, which I don't like the title anymore because indigeneity in Latin America would be much better because indigenous people, I mean, there are so many different ones and you just put them, all of them under that kind of umbrella and it's not correct. But what happens there? So I'm teaching through texts, written texts in Spanish. So that's an issue. And I tell the students that's an issue because writing was brought to the Americas through an invasion and it was an imposition and it was a weapon to colonize the Americas. I mean, you know, the written word, the Bible, and you know, the encomiendas, so the written decrees that said that that land belonged to that encomendero, that person, that man, and the Indians and the indigenous people working in that land also belonged to him. That was all written. So, you know, as you know, in the Americas, there was a different kind of writing, the codices, and different kind of, you know, drawings, and but not the written word as we know it today. But I'm using that to teach them about indigenous people. And I'm using the Spanish, which is the language of the colonizer. So, but in my department, we teach in target, you know, in the languages of our majors at that level of, you know, the early studies courses. And in the States, Spanish is the language of resistance. But it's not in Latin America for sure, and even less if you're teaching, you know, Maya or Quechua or Aymara cultures. But how do I do? You know, I harden myself to speak a little bit of one or two of those languages. And say, how do I do that? So I have to make a, you know, these close things and say, well, this is what we're doing. So from the beginning, we are fighting the canon, but depending how you see it, we are already decolonizing the canon, but it's not true, we are not. You know, we try to, but there's no way because of the language, you know, the language prevents us from doing this. So that worries me. It's a concern of mine how you do that. And for instance, Spanish is a very good example because it changes so much from place to place. In my hometown of, you know, home plains of Catalonia, Spanish is also the language of kind of the colonizer, but you know what? The Catalan people and the ones that speak Catalan are by and large the Catalan bourgeoisie. And the ones that speak Spanish are the ones who came as, you know, migrants, internal migrants, domestic migrants from other parts of Spain in the 60s. And they are the bulk of the working class, at least in the 60s and 70s. So, you know, again, who is oppressed, who is the oppressed? I find that very difficult to answer. And I just will bring two examples and then I think better we open it to everybody. And one thing is, for instance, Mignolo. And you know, I like him and I like to watch him. I mean, what he writes is very interesting. But Mignolo is from Argentina. He writes in English, of course. And I also write in English, and well, I try to. But you know, what happened is that Mignolo is really kind of questioned by intellectuals from Latin America who work in Latin America and who write in Spanish, because they see him as somebody who's been colonized in his own way. So he talks about decoloniality, and actually, I mean, we have so many books, and the last one on decoloniality is very interesting, but still, that language issue is there. And to many people, like, I don't know whether you're familiar with Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui from Bolivia, Mignolo has used her work, she's an anthropologist, she works a lot about the symbolism of coca leaves and how coca is also something that is being used to be seen as, you know, kind of evil thing when really in reality it's part of culture in the Aymara picture world and so on and so forth. And she doesn't, I mean, she's written about how she feels she's being used and her work is being used by him because he kind of transfers what she's saying in Bolivia, La Paz, to Duke University where he is, Mignolo, and then he writes about her work, but she doesn't like it because she thinks that she can use, and it's not that she's being decolonized, she doesn't care about it. So that's what kind of, these are the things that worry me, so it's a bit different. It's the same, I mean, everything, the bottom line is very similar, but these are the daily things that I kind of struggle with. And my last example, is that I would like to say that the only conclusion I get from all of this is that it depends on the locus, and this is a postcolonial kind of concept where you are located, and not you physically, but your own culture. Probably your locus would change through your life depending what you do and who you are. But that kind of locus identity, which is mobile and it changes, is changeable. It depends on the locus that you will see that. So, canon, the concept of canon, the concept of coloniality, decoloniality, I don't think can be fixed. It's just, it might be theoretical, it might be possible when it comes to the practical thing. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I wouldn't like to say no, you can't. I just haven't found the way to do it. And the last example is when I came here in 2009, that's when the year was hired. I am, and I should say that as well, I was a visiting assistant professor by then. Then we were grandfathered as, assistant professor track as term faculty. So I'm term faculty, I'm a social professor at the term. And it's interesting because when I came from Latin America, so for me, somebody like Guamán Poma de Ayala, who wrote in 1617, the same time as Cervantes was about to publish Quixote, and Shakespeare was publishing, so we're talking about the 17th century. He wrote a very interesting book that was found in the first half of the 20th century in Denmark, at the Library of Copenhagen. And that book was an opening the eyes of most colonialists in Latin America, but also in other parts of the world, because it was written by Quechua-speaking intellectual that was trying to use Spanish to write to King Philip II, denouncing the ills of the Spanish administration during colonial times. So that book is written in Spanish, and it's called La Nueva Crónica y el Buen Gobierno, the New Chronicle and Good Government, and it's very interesting because he's talking about good government in the 17th century. So he's talking about government